Welcome to the Disability and Podcast, bringing together thoughtful discussion and debate. This month, artist and creative practitioner Steph Robson, aka Hello Little Lady, chats with award-winning theatre maker and equality strategist Vici Wreford-Sinnott. Steph asks Vici about the importance of regional identity, the North East's role in disability arts history, and the current regional and national landscape for disabled artists.
Hello, I'm Steph, and today I'm hosting the Disability and Podcast. And for this episode, I'm interviewing Vici Wreford-Sinnott. Hello, Vici. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, Steph. How lovely to be here. I'm Vici Wreford-Sinnott, and I am a tall white woman in my 50s. Today, I have teal and pink hair. I'm wearing dark-rimmed glasses, a teal scarf and a black top. And I am a playwright and television writer and director and long-time activist. And I like supporting organisations to improve and increase their disability equality knowledge.
Thanks, Vici. And I am a petite 40-odd-year-old woman who is also based in the North East, and I am a multidisciplinary artist who centres my practice in visual, participatory and many other practices around the lived experiences of dwarfism. And in this particular episode, we're actually going to be talking about Vici's vast experience in disability arts in the North East, which I can't wait for us to find out more about. So, Vici, thank you for joining the podcast today. The focus is on regional voices. And I guess, can you outline the importance of the North East in developing disability arts in the UK? Could you just give us a history of it, of how it came about and how it developed?
I'd love to, yeah. I think it's important to say, first of all, that regional voices are essential in the national picture. But I think that, each region of the country, each country in the British Isles has its own particular cultures, idiosyncrasies, and they're really complex and I think distinct, and so it's important to talk about them. But they shouldn't really be separated from the national landscape or from national significance, which I think historically sometimes we've done. We always look to the South as if the South is the national picture. We have to put our flag in the ground and say we're part of the national scene.
Absolutely.
The North East does have a really rich past of activism and politicisation for all sorts of reasons, for our social and historical contexts in industry. But in terms of disability arts, I think the North East's it's a bit of a hidden jewel in lots of ways. In the beginnings, in the 80s, we had the Lawnmowers, which is a learning disability theatre company for people who don't know. They were set up in 1986 with the support of them wifeys, who were a community-oriented group. The Lawnmowers were the first sort of self-organised disability arts group in the North East, and they still go today, and they're internationally renowned, which is brilliant. They hit the scene with shows like The Big Sex Show. They were never mincing their words about, about what disabled people want to talk about. And they produced a brilliant theatre show, a brilliant video about it. And they firmly put learning disability culture on the map. And then there were other amazing people involved at the beginnings, like Jeff Armstrong, who sadly is no longer with us. But he really championed disability arts in London. He was in at the beginning of London Disability Arts Forum. Then he set up the National Disability Arts Forum, which was based in Newcastle. And he worked alongside powerhouses like Paula Greenwell, who was a phenomenal activist in the North East, involved in all sorts of disabled people's organisations. We had other people like Stuart Bracking, Tom Shakespeare, Colin Cameron, and my very long-term friend Karen Sheeder, who was part of the Fugitives punk band. Very, politicised, influenced by the brilliant Ian Stanton. but really who stayed with the disability arts movement in this region and helped to shape it. She's good humoured. She's brilliant for a laugh. She's a very witty communicator, which I think's essential when you're trying to get a message across. But she's a brilliant songwriter as well. So I feel like you have to acknowledge the people who paved the way. And she was part of Tyneside Disability Arts in sort of the mid-90s, late 90s. And that was one of the most, active sort of cultural organisations led by disabled people. And they did comedy, satire, cabarets, and they really brought the scene alive, in the North East. So there's several decades worth of work there that got us started. So I think we're indebted to them in the North East.
Thinking about your own role within that, what has been your personal highlights of some of the key moments in disability arts in the North East?
Yeah.
And in the UK?
Yeah, well, I think, gosh, it takes me back. I am somebody who wears rose-tinted spectacles, definitely, but I am such a believer in community, and I love thinking back to the moments when the community really came together. I'm a real collectivist. I think my first connections with the disability arts sector were I had set up a learning disability women's group in Hartlepool called the Moving On Project, and I wasn't identifying as a disabled person at this point. I wasn't politicised around disability. I had lots of lessons yet to learn. But because we were one of, this quite unusual group, a women's learning disability group, who were very visual, very vocal, we did get invited to loads of disability arts events. And so I can remember one in particular, Spennymoor Leisure Centre, a disability arts cabaret, an audience of 200 people. Can you believe?
Wow.
200 people. And there we were, the Moving On group, talking about their passions. But also on the bill, there was Ian Stanton, The Fugitives, and it was compared by the most wonderful character called Mavis Dishcloth, played by Sue Vass, who was another person in at the beginning. And Mavis Dishcloth, obviously, was there to tell us about how brilliant she was at making dishcloths at a time when that's what people thought we were good for. Do you know what I mean? Making dishcloths and basket weaving. So there weren't many opportunities, but these kind of cabarets exploded onto the arts scene and really put to bed lots of myths about disability. And it was a time of such a force for change, and I think people really appreciated each other's work. We'd have people doing music, drama, comedy, poetry, any art form that you can imagine, film. And so, it was brilliant memories of that time. I was also personally out of the country for almost 4 years. From 1999 to 2003, because I was working in disability arts in the Republic of Ireland. And a constant source of support, nourishment, community was the Etc. newsletter that came from the National Disability Arts Forum. And I think it was every Monday or Tuesday, it would plop into your inbox and you'd be in touch with everything that was going on all around the country. You'd hear about theatre shows, dance productions, artists working in new forms and pushing the boundaries. And that was a brilliant connection for people. And that was before Disability Arts Online, really. And obviously Disability Arts Online is mushroomed and grown to be this amazing journal and active living thing about disability arts. In terms of visual arts, there was quite a special exhibition on at the Lang Art Gallery. This was before my time. I wasn't involved in this. But again, it was quite controversial, actually. The Lang Art Gallery now, I suppose, could be described as a little bit more commercial. It has to, like many art galleries, it has to find a way to pay its way. But back then it commissioned the Unleashed exhibition of disabled artists from all around the country, included people like Tony Heaton, who's a complete legend in sculpture and, visual arts. And I think his piece was Great Britain from a Wheelchair was included in that. But that felt like such a time of optimism. We'd made it into a big gallery and were being taken seriously. And there was controversy around it because disabled people hadn't been seen in this way socially or culturally before, with such loud, bold, confident, self-determined voices. So I think that was quite a key turning point.
Oh, fantastic. I've just got so many questions just within that one answer. But I guess, I'm going off a little bit here. But at what point did you become an activist or collectivist, or, you became politicized about, being an artist and being passionate about the Northeast arts and what have you? What was that? Was there a key moment, or does it happen gradually? What happened?
That's a really good question. And it's something from my perspective, because I wasn't born as a disabled person, although in terms of mental health, you could argue that I just wasn't aware of it until my teens, really. I didn't know I was different in that way until my teens. But I also didn't know that mental health fitted under the disability umbrella at that time, because nobody's telling you. Even now, people ask, do I fit under that umbrella or not? Am I allowed to join this club or not? But in terms of politicisation, I'd always been quite a political animal, I have to say. I came through punk rock, wanted to challenge the status quo, ask all the big questions. And then I arrived at feminism when I went to university. My eyes were completely opened. My world opened up when I learned about women in theatre, and that stayed in my heart ever since. But then I think around university time, my mental health status changed and I became less well with it. And I wasn't sure quite where to put myself. When I set up my first theatre company, I was drawn to people who were marginalised. And I think that's why I had an affinity with the Moving On group that I talked about, the women's group in Hartlepool that I set up. And then, I was kind of drawn a little bit into the disability arts world, but still didn't quite know how to identify at that time. And it wasn't until I went to the Republic of Ireland and I had had some political awakenings there. And it was through people like Donald Tolan, who was an amazing disability activist, sadly someone else who's no longer with us. I brought Matt Fraser's show, Seal Boy Freak, over to Dublin. And that was a seminal moment for me, because I absolutely understood what disability was and aligned myself with those politics instantly. And sometimes it takes a piece of art to do that. And then I slowly worked my way through, processed things, talked to some of my disabled artist colleagues over there, and who had different views on it, But it was around that time when I was in Dublin, and I think because of Matt Fraser's play, and I also worked with an amazing artist called Rosaline McDonough, who's an incredibly accomplished traveller woman who's disabled, is a phenomenal playwright, and I had the privilege of working with her on her first piece of theatre. And again, when you're working with somebody else, you're sort of also working through your own stuff. So yeah, the politics kicked in around then, and so that for me that was the sort of the mid to late 90s.
So I was going to say, so you started off in the Northeast, and then you went over to the Republic of Ireland, and then you've come back over to the Northeast. So how has the Northeast, that's given you also a regional identity?
Yeah.
How has that played out in your own work? Because you've got the national identity going on, but how has the Northeast specifically shaped you in terms of the regional identity and your artwork?
I grew up in the East Durham coalfield, and my world straddled the world of the miners who worked underground and small-scale farmers who worked on the ground. And so, both of my grandparents one was a miner, one was a small-scale farmer. My dad was a farmer. The land was in his blood. And life didn't always feel like a struggle, but there always felt like there were these external pressures and tensions. And certainly that played out, obviously, with the miners in the 80s. And so I in my life, didn't have a lot of stereotypical women. And I don't know if such a thing exists, if you know what I mean. They were women who weren't like models on the telly or frilly pink Barbies, or they were women who rolled their sleeves up and got on with things, which I hope is what I do to this day, But I think in that sense, there's something undeniably northern about that environment that I grew up in, and that formed me. Those early experiences absolutely shaped the kind of woman that I was destined to become, I suppose. But I also wanted a little bit more than was on offer culturally. I don't know how these things happen, but I was drawn to the arts. I loved the theatre of punk. I loved the costumes. I loved the fact you could reinvent yourself and look stunning, as I thought. You could walk through the middle of your village and turn heads and feel empowered and politicised. So I think those things came about because I'm from a northeast tiny village. I do also have a strange relationship with the northeast, and I think lots of disabled people do, because unfortunately ableism, it's everywhere. Culturally, institutionally, politically, it's a very misunderstood form of discrimination. And so, I am from the northeast with great pride, but I also see that internally we've still got some things to sort out, really. And the old-fashioned flat cap image of the man in his allotment or at the club with his pint or whatever couldn't be further from what the northeast has been to me, which has never been monocultural. It's always been multicultural and intersectional.
Like a miner,
yeah,
that's like the traditional view, and
that's right.
I'm in my early 40s, and that's, no, that's not how I know the Northeast, It's
absolutely.
It's such a culturally rich, from the top to the bottom of the region,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. No, you're absolutely right. It's a complex region, and I think, like you say, we've got a very rich mix of cultures here. And that's what excites me about this region, and that definitely feeds into my work and wanting to make better work and work that better represents, reflects or interprets, who we are.
How would you describe the people of the Northeast in cultural terms?
In cultural terms, it's such a hard question to answer in a way, but I think
because I know there's not one like monolithic.
That's it.
Thing, but
yeah, there's not. But what I would say is that everyday culture is rich, and people see that songs, music, poetry, whether it's in advertising, whether it's on the telly, whether it's the stories people tell each other. And my goodness, the sense of humour in the Northeast. It's a little bit like Scotland for me in that sense, the sense of humour that I relish in those old stories where there's a bit of mischief and a bit of trickery, so you can surprise whoever you're telling the story to. That's certainly, there's a history of that in my family. I'm sure there is in other people's. And so I think humour plays a big part. And I don't know if that's to do with probably a mix of we all need a release. We all need to feel better about stuff. But also, a bit of self-deprecation, and a bit of satire, definitely, because I think we're a very knowing region. I think we know that we've been underserved. The way that everything's divvied up across the country isn't exactly fair. And I don't mean to idealise the region, because I think it is full of problems, as everywhere is. And that's what I was saying about the battle that I have around ableism. But, well, we can talk more about that. But I think just in terms of answering your question, there's diversity here. And I think finally we're getting to see that. There's some arts organisations in the North East who are genuinely committed to reflecting who our communities are. Not in the stereotype, not in monoculture, white culture, but in all of our glory. And I think that's so important.
I was going to say, how do you feel, how our regional identity has been marginalised in the arts, and what challenges around that have you faced in the past? And, is there any evidence of that now?
Good question. Yeah, I think that the regional identities generally are marginalised, but I would say from my perspective, sadly, the North East, there's a mixture of things going on. I think when you're under-resourced as a region, and I'm talking culturally and politically, not as invested in, then I think you naturally feel marginalised. And I think there's something we do internalise or have internalised in the North East, which has been, well, we might not be good enough. What if we're not good enough? And sometimes that means that we don't actually shout about the excellence that's here quite enough. And I believe that we should, do that more. But also in terms of disability arts, and I can't fully explain why this is, but I do think quite often we've been missed off the national map with that. When I've seen reports written or I've seen videos made about disability and deaf arts across the country, and there's a gap. There's no Northeastern artist featured there, or which it feels, I don't know, it feels difficult because at one time, some of our listeners will remember this, there was what kind of gets called the golden age of disability arts, where many, many regions around the country did have a disability arts development organisation that was led by disabled people. In our region, it was Northern Disability Arts Forum, which became Arcadea. There were lots of ways that we did come together nationally. These regional disability arts organisations would forge national alliances. And when there's an infrastructure there, it's much easier to do that. But unfortunately, over time, the organisations slowly disappeared, funding was withdrawn and things like that. And so then I feel like you have to work twice as hard if you're from a northern region to get yourself back on the map again. And for me, that's part of, my struggle as an artist, to be taken seriously with national significance. I think also within the region, we still have to make the case consistently as disabled people that we should have a slice of that pie, or a bigger piece of the pie, please, because, we're a bit fed up of having the crumbs, and that can be exhausting, can't it?
Yeah. I'll just ask you an additional question to that. What do you think that the internet has played, what the role has helped platform Northeast arts more?
I would say in my experience it probably has. So pre-pandemic, I think that was definitely a brilliant way to connect and communicate. And I think where we'd seen that disinvestment that I talked about, where disabled artists weren't supported by those regional organisations, at the same time, the advent of the internet meant that we sort of rethought how we did things, and we found other ways to connect and set up online groups. And I think for lots of disabled people, meeting people online, other like-minded people, has been an amazing source of release and connection and identity, you know. And I think being introduced to that releases you from some of the isolation. And then I think within the pandemic, it had a huge role to play. I don't want to underestimate, though, how many people don't have access to the internet and were still left out. And I think for lots of people, that's true. You know, and I think we have to do something about that. Having said that, I think lots of people did in the pandemic, because it became one of the only ways to communicate. And here we are talking on Zoom, and for me that was a lifeline.
I'm thinking in terms of like art and disability arts, and also in terms of funding. Like all of a sudden there were funding available for online projects, which traditionally in the current funding landscape that we find ourselves in, which is very much place-based, you know, we suddenly, I think maybe disability artists and groups maybe actually found themselves actually being funded for projects that they wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise. And so in that terms, I think, you know, I thought that was a very good experience, not necessarily in general, but like for disability arts in the North East to actually platform, because you did your, you know, you did your various commissions throughout that period, you know, and you platformed the new generation of artists that have come through from the North East. So I guess, you know, what has the impact of that been, and has there been a legacy with that, or has it translated into a post-pandemic world? What's your thoughts on that?
No, you're absolutely spot on about the way that funding radically changed very quickly during the pandemic, and the online opportunities that opened up. I think in lots of ways were really impressive. I think that actually disabled artists and disability arts organisations were at the forefront of some of that. And I know with the Disconsortia Collective, you know, at the time we were meeting regularly. We had ambitions for the region, and we noted that disabled people were probably going to be more disadvantaged in lots of ways during the pandemic, and quickly formulated correspondence with the Arts Council, asking them, you know, to think about that, and to think about including access in any emergency funding they were providing. I would say it felt like there were 2 years of fairly solid, in community terms. I'm not talking about necessarily individual disabled people who might be audience members or participants rather than artists. But I think in terms of artists, that community of interest, that cultural community was relevant. And like you said, it wasn't place-based necessarily. And I think I was involved in some regional projects online. Like you said, commissioned some regional disabled artists. But also there were some national commissions in there as well. It was important. I think it connected people up from around the country.
How do you feel like it is in a post-pandemic world? And like what efforts do you think are evident, or maybe not, in the changing landscape of the arts and cultural sector at the moment?
I think it's a very interesting time. I think I now find it a time of concern again. I feel like lots of disabled artists had opportunities to make work during the pandemic. We could test form, we could try out different ways of communicating different ideas and experiences. Access was firmly on the agenda. I felt like regional organisations listened and wanted to learn from disabled people. You know, I found myself and other disabled artists invited to talk about accessibility. I'm always careful when I talk about accessibility to say that access is the nuts and bolts of equality. It's the things that need to be in place as the basics from which to build a much bigger picture of equality, which is cultural equality and disabled-led work. I think that's a harder message to get across. But I am delighted to be able to have conversations with significant organisations in the region. I genuinely do get a feeling that there's a will around change because of some of the conversations that happened during the pandemic. But I can't deny that the interest around accessibility has slipped considerably. I think the fact that lots of disabled people still need hybrid opportunities to take part in the arts has slipped considerably, and people just want to get back to how it was before. And unfortunately, I'm really sorry, but it's not going to get back to how it was before because we've all been changed in lots of ways. That means audiences have changed. It means participants have changed. It means what people want has changed. And so I think really the arts sector, the cultural sector, needs to take stock of that and have a good review.
What specific things were you actually worried about? But like things are sliding.
I think that because things are so uncertain generally in the arts, I think organisations are trying to recover from something huge, which really impacted on whether organisations were going to survive or not. And some organisations are still struggling to survive, no matter how well resourced they might appear to be, in terms of their commitments and in terms of what they want to achieve. I think that organisations are quite strapped for cash. And so what that means is that diversity moves further and further down the agenda, in my experience. Unfortunately, things that are seen as either luxuries, never thought I'd be perceived as a luxury as a disabled person, but, work that might not be perceived as reaching a majority, or where organisations feel that they can't take risks. They're risk averse. They're frightened about whether a disability show will sell as well as something else will. That they are concerns for me. I think when organisations are programming work, they're doing it to protect themselves. And so I think if they don't fully understand disability and disabled people as audience members or as visitors to, museums or galleries, then it's possible we'll slip further down the list. The counter I would give to that, though, is an example of something I've just been involved in. If I could just mention our Stomping Grounds Festival of Learning Disability Culture at ARC, which grew from a tiny, tiny seed from Full Circle, which is a learning disability theatre company I work with. And they just wanted to have a special day that brought people together after being apart for so long. Anyway, it grew into a 2-day festival, of course. And the ideas got bigger and bigger. And we did it as safely as we could. But over 500 people came to the festival.
Wow.
Over the 2 days.
Fantastic.
And that was phenomenal. The building was alive. It was buzzing. So I think if organisations address their fear of risk and think about, where are there some examples of really good practice where communities have come into buildings on a large scale? What's gone into that? What's been the turnaround? What's the relationships that have been developed there that have made something like that happen? And you can actually change your audiences and bring new audiences in on quite a decent scale. So, I hope that as organisations fight their way out of this phase, that they do rebuild themselves and we do see them prepared to take risks. Notional risks. I don't think it's a risk to programme disability-related work, but I know that lots of programmers do, unfortunately. Obviously, the arts have got to survive and they have to work to a business model, but I think that we need to think about new business models for different kinds of audiences. I might have gone off topic slightly, but I think that these are all important considerations when we're talking about, well, what is the landscape like now? One thing that does excite me, if I can tell you about a project that I'm involved with, which is called Cultural Shift. Between 2015 and 2018, along with Ark in Stockton, who I find to be a beacon of really good practice, a brilliant ethos around disabled people, and they really support disabled artists and audiences. I was lucky enough to develop with them a project called Cultural Shift, which was a model of practice which gave space to disabled-led work in mainstream venues. And really it's about power sharing. It's about cultural democracy, and how big institutions, which comparatively to disability organisations or to freelancers, are very well resourced, have some stability. I say that cautionary, but more stability and certainty certainly than freelancers do. And so this was a model that tested some of that power sharing. How do organisations embrace disabled-led work and try to move on from the inclusive model, which is an important model, but the inclusive model has lots of limitations on it because it says you're welcome to come into what's here already, which isn't necessarily about disabled people's voices. They're making things accessible, which is important, but disabled people, we need to see ourselves reflected in culture. And so this project, Cultural Shift, did that. And there was lots of learning from it. There's been a legacy ever since. But the exciting thing is that we've now got 6 regional partners on board, and we're doing an R&D for the region so that we can kind of set up a 3-year programme that creates an imprint for the North East region to do better in terms of disabled-led work in publicly funded organisations. And that's so exciting. I'm consulting people on that at the moment, venues, disabled artists, and the bottom line is that art will be at the heart of it, which means that disabled artists are at the centre of it. And so it'll be about commissions for new work, residencies, and supporting artists while the organisations develop and learn to do disability equality better.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that sounds amazing. So are you involved in that as yourself or as Little Cog, or is that part of your...
Yeah. No, that's me really. I came up with this phrase, equality strategist, which means it's because there's a funny little bit of my brain that loves thinking about strategies for change. And we can only do it if we are strategic and tactical and clever and cute. We have to be mischief makers and come up with new ways in, which is why art's at the heart of it. But it is me really as a freelancer, I think. And who knows where that'll take us.
Do you feel that the North East cultural organisations are actually quite open to talking to disabled artists and being open to being challenged for the way they run or engage with artists?
I think there's a real mix, if I'm honest. I think, I have a particular perspective. I've got a historical relationship with some of the region's organisations from when I was the chief executive of Arcadia. And my job there was to knock on doors and to keep knocking on doors. And there was during that time, there was a lot less reception. And it was a tricky, exhausting time. I think genuinely there are people within the organisations who get cultural democracy, who know that the arts have to be about our communities. You can't keep going with that old-fashioned, almost stuffy colonial approach to the arts, which is so outdated. So on the one hand, there will be organisations with really good people in them. What we need to make happen is that goodness that transfers from individuals to the organisations. So
best practice.
Absolutely. And so it gets embedded in the organisation, and we need to see more of that, because it definitely isn't yet. And that's partly because mainstream organisations either haven't been able to, haven't wanted to, or have had constraints on them about why they haven't gone down that, the disability equality route and embedding that in their organisations. I think people are scared of it. I think they think it costs a lot of money. I think they think it's really complicated, and what if they get it wrong? But then there are some organisations that are still really old-fashioned. A few years ago now, I went to a creative case meeting, and I was one of the few people there who were from a diverse community. It was mainly NPOs and, they were probably RFOs at that time, regularly funded organisations. And I can remember being seated at this table where a man who was the director of an organisation was rolling his eyes, sighing and saying, "Are we still talking about this?" Exasperated that he was having to put his time and energy into people who were different to him, really not getting, he was there to serve his communities, and had no idea about who was in his communities from things that he went on to say. And unfortunately, that attitude is there in the arts. It still is. I do have hope, though. I'm an eternal optimist. Mm-hmm. I think you have to be if you're an activist. It's fine to take time out and rest. And not everybody has to be an activist. So I don't want people to think that, there's a pressure there to be an activist. It's just unfortunate when you're a disabled artist, a lot of the time you do have to self-advocate. So you are fighting a battle as well as just being an artist. You do fight battles. But I do think, and certainly from the conversations I'm having with these 6 organisations at the moment, another organisation who I'm lucky enough to have been commissioned by as an artist, Live Theatre, I'm having some brilliant conversations with them. And, their 50th anniversary programme really excites me. Under their new director, Jack McNamara, he's programmed more disability-led work than ever before at Live Theatre. And that is so exciting. There's a real buzz, around that. So that in a theatre context, in my art form, I feel passionate about that. But also the Cultural Shift partners who we're doing the R&D with are across art forms. They include museums and galleries, music, modern art, theatre, interdisciplinary work, cross-disciplinary work. So that feels exciting as well. The openness that I'm finding there, and the people there know that they need to embed it in the organisations, and they know they need to understand more about the cultural equality of disabled people.
I think I've just got one other question in terms of, regional identity, like for the North East, and, how are disability artists from the region actually beginning to, create a new identity for the region? How are we contributing to that conversation?
I think that's one of the most exciting things for me that I've seen in the last 10 years, really, is that a new generation of disabled artists. And what I mean by that is that there's a new level of engagement. There's a new level of people identifying as disabled people at the moment. And so that community is incredibly diverse. And how those disabled people view themselves is really refreshing. There are new dialogues about what it is to be a disabled person, and how people want to be, regarded and identified. I think the other thing is that we see new art forms, cross art forms, and really experimental work. And when I say experimental, I don't mean it's not accessible to audiences. It's very accessible to audiences. It's just that new thought has gone into it. And that really excites me. I think there's a group of incredibly exciting artists in this region. And I just want to see them fly, I want opportunities there for artists. And and for doors to open in our biggest venues.
And how are we contributing to the national conversation around disability arts? Do you know what I mean? Like, what is our involvement? Is it prominent? Could it be better? How do we do that? What would your ideas be? What are your thoughts?
I think there still aren't enough places for those conversations to be happening. What was really good when we were coming out of the lockdowns phase of the pandemic, I hosted 4 crucial conversations, they were called, and they were with disabled artists to think about new ways of working, what could a new normal possibly look like, because not everybody wanted to go back to how it was before. It wasn't that great for disabled people. So what some of the changes that had been made possible during the pandemic, we wanted that to continue. So I think there's some real thought leaders in the North East. I really do believe that. I mean, there's people, Lady Kit's work is phenomenal, in terms of social engagement, how co-creation projects can inform artistic policy, how we create safe spaces for people. Simon McKeown, who is a long-time disabled artist with international reputation, is a professor now at Teesside University. He is doing some phenomenal work on an international scale around how disabled people have been represented in very modern art forms, in the digital world, in games. Your own work, Steph, is revolutionary, is pioneering, in terms of the dwarfism community, but also not just that, not for that reason alone. The work that you do is so open and accessible, but incredibly experimental, and when we don't see a lot of that work. And so your voice is incredibly important to the disability arts movement in this region, but also nationally. I hope people do, pay attention. I think we need to see a few more national gatherings of disability arts. Mm-hmm. We do need to have some more opportunities to come together and share work, and share the thinking. I think it's important, particularly at this time.
Well, thank you very much, Vici, for your chat today. Do you have a website or something that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Oh, thank you. I think probably a good overview of the work that I'm involved with would be on Little Cog's website. So yeah, if you check out www.littlecog.co.uk, then that'll tell you lots more about not only our work, but the work of other disabled artists in the region.
Well, thank you for being on today's episode of the Disability and Podcast, and best of luck with future projects.
Thank you so much. My absolute pleasure. It's been brilliant to talk to you, Steph.
Thank you for listening. We do hope you enjoyed this episode of Disability And. Please join us next month when Paul Wilshaw chats with founders of Triple C and the Disability Arts Network community, Cherry Lee Houston and Melissa Johns.